All right, we have begun recording. I want to welcome everybody to the Bi-State Small Scale Ag Conference. This is the second year that we are doing this reformed style of the Small Scale Ag Conference. The Bi-State Extension Programs group is made up of a group of educators from Purdue University Extension and University of Illinois Extension. So we welcome you here this evening. This evening's topics include poultry production and poultry management with Darren Karcher from Purdue University. And then later this evening, we will hear from Andrew Corsi on aquaculture in the states of Indiana and Illinois. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Darren Karcher, our Purdue University Poultry Extension Specialist.
Thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure to talk to everyone tonight. And so talk a little bit about poultry management. And I thought before I get started here, I'd give everyone a little bit about me. And so I grew up with poultry. My parents own a mail order hatchery, so I've been doing this since I can remember. Had my formal training in ag education at Ohio State. And at the conclusion, when everybody was going off to take teaching exams to start teaching ag, I decided to go to the University of Wisconsin and get a master's in poultry genetics. While I was there, I met my PhD advisor here at Purdue University and got my PhD in 2007. At the conclusion of that, moved to Michigan State University, where I was the poultry extension specialist there. And in 2016, returned here to Purdue University in a similar position. So even though the crowd is sparse at the moment, this evening, I'd like to give all of my presentations as very informal, and we're going to hit some general information this evening. If you have questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box. I have it up so I can see them as they come across. And that's what will make our evening more interactive as we go. So I thought with currently we have high path avian influenza that is popping up in random spots around the world. We've got some low path avian influenza here in the US. And so I thought it would be good if we just hit some of the biosecurity basics. So when we talk about our biosecurity, what we're really talking about is the fact that we're talking about bio, which is life, and security means protect. So what we're trying to do is to take measures or ways to make sure that we keep our disease agents out of our flock and to keep our flocks healthy. This could be things like bacteria, viruses, funguses. It could be anything like that that we don't want introduced into our flock that could cause them health issues. So when we think about it, we really have three major components. One is isolation. So we want to keep our flock away from other animals. So it could be other wild birds or other chicken flocks. It could be traffic control as our second component, which is we want to know who or what is visiting our flocks. And then the other one is sanitation. So we want to make sure that we keep our equipment and our buildings clean at all times. So some things to think about when we talk about ways to protect our flock. When we start to talk about people, it's not uncommon to have small flock practitioners go and visit swap meets, maybe, and it's not uncommon that you get a phone call that says, hey, you have chickens at home. I just got some chickens. We've got some sick birds. Do you mind taking a moment and just coming over and looking to see what's going on? That's okay, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But what you want to make sure that you do is you take the time to change your clothes and your shoes before you go to visit the birds that are sick. And then when you come home, change out of those quickly or immediately and shower. And the idea behind this is that if you go to visit sick birds, you can bring disease agents with you back to your own flock. And if you by chance have something going on in your flock and go to see someone else, you could also take something to your neighbors. And so it's just good practice to have a separation of clothes that you use when you work with your own birds versus birds that you may go see with someone else. So, I tell my children this all the time, please don't wear your street clothes, shoes into the chicken coop, put on your chore clothes. Same sort of concept for you to keep in mind. The other thing is, if you're going to have people come and look at your birds, it would be ideal if you could give them something to protect your birds. An easy way to do this would be if you could have them do something with their shoes. That tends to be the biggest way that they're going to track something in. It could be that you've just got a brush there in a bucket, and you just have them brush whatever dirt, mud, poop, anything off the bottom of their shoes before they step into your chicken coop. The other thing you could do would be to give them coveralls and boots and really go to a high level of biosecurity. I can honestly say I don't know that I've seen any small flock people practice it to that level, but it's always an option. But the one thing and an easy way to do this would be, if you wanted to, you could easily get those plastic shopping bags that we get when we go grocery shopping and slip them over your shoes before you step into the chicken coop. When you're done, then you can take them off, throw them away. It's going to give you a level of protection better than doing nothing. And so those are, some things to think about when you're trying to practice some biosecurity with your birds. Now, when we start talking about animals, not only do we want to keep our wild birds and rodents out, we also want to make sure that we're not letting cats and dogs come in and visit our flock. There are some transmissible diseases between cats and chickens. And so we want to make sure that we're limiting any sort of that exposure, as well as picking up our daily dead. The thing to keep in mind with birds, and we'll talk about it again later on, when we think about birds, they explore their environment by pecking and by scratching. So if you have dead birds and you're not timely in picking up your mortality, those birds are naturally going to go over and they're going to investigate this pile of feathers that isn't moving any longer. And the way they're going to do that is by pecking at it. And inadvertently, as they peck at it, they're going to consume some of that dead bird. Maybe that's not really something you wanted to hear, but at the end of the day, that is how we're going to get some transmission between our different birds and our poultry flock. The other thing we need to think about is quarantining, and when is it important that we're quarantining? Ideally, if we're going to take our birds out, be for a 4-H show, or we're going to go to a swap meet and take some birds out of our flock, if we bring them back to our birds, we want to try to keep them isolated for about 21 days. That would give any disease that they may have been exposed to sufficient time to manifest, for you to figure out what's going on and how to take care of that sickness before introducing those birds back into your flock. If we have that and we have a quarantine situation with some birds, we're going to want to do all of our other chores first, interact with our quarantined birds at the end of the day, just because then we're going to go inside and wash our clothes and clean up. If we can practice that, if there is anything that would manifest, you're standing a very good odds then of not transmitting anything from those quarantine birds back to your own flock and having a much bigger problem. Now, when we talk about buildings, we want to make sure that we're cleaning out our buildings at least twice a year. Once is an absolute, twice is up to you. If we have a dirt floor, we want to turn over that top 6 inches of soil in between flocks. That way, if you had any sort of issues, disease, if you had worms, anything like that, what you're going to try to do then by turning over that top 6 inches is to bury that and hopefully let Mother Nature take care of it and you don't have to deal with it. The other thing you could do is go in and flame the soil, but I'm not real sure how effective that will be for you at the end of the day, and not real sure that you have an effective means to go in and actually flame the top few inches of soil. The other thing that can help you when we talk about trying to clean out in between would be to give your building some downtime. So ideally, what would be great is if you could clean out, give it about 2 weeks to just let it sit empty. That way, Mother Nature can take and disinfect and just let time handle it. If you can't, if you can have a little bit of downtime between your flocks, that would be fantastic. It really is going to come down to your ability to clean and disinfect your building in between flocks. If you've had a disease challenge in between, or this set of birds had a disease challenge, you depopulated, and now you're going to start again, I would encourage you to really think about keeping that 2 week or maybe a little bit longer downtime. If you haven't had any issues, then you can, cheat a little bit, maybe go a week, but you still want to try to have some of that downtime to help you with the cleanup. The other thing is that we can reduce the amount of pests getting into our flocks, and we're going to do this by making sure that we keep our grass mowed around our building, remove any piles or any harborage areas for those rodents within 100 feet. The other thing is that we can screen our openings with 1/2-inch screen to keep those rodents and pests out. The thing to keep in mind when we talk about rodents is when you keep that area around your chicken coop mowed, or even if you wanted to go in and put some gravel about a 6-inch diameter around the chicken coop, rodents are very resistant because of behavior to want to run across an open area that is completely exposed for fear of being picked off by predators. And so all you're doing, if you set yourself up by keeping it mowed, maybe putting down some gravel around the perimeter, is just overall reducing that potential rodent load or other pests that may be getting into your chicken coop. Now, when we talk about our equipment, we want to make sure that we're washing and disinfecting our waters and feed pans. Ideally, you would want to go through and do that at least once a week. It could easily be just taking a scrub brush and some soapy water and just scrubbing it real quickly. It doesn't have to be overly thorough when you have your birds in there, and then do an extremely thorough job after your birds are gone. But we want to do that at least once a week. The idea is that we're trying to get rid of any of that filmy buildup. It could be a biofilm. It could just be an accumulation of minerals if you have hard water. Soap and hot water can help you. The other thing that you can also do is to add some acidification to your water. Real easy to do. You can do it with vinegar. You could also do it with some chlorine water, and we can talk about the chlorine water in a little bit. The other thing is that we want to clean and disinfect before we ever start with our baby birds. We want to make sure that we're giving them the best opportunity to start out on the right foot as we're beginning our poultry enterprise. And so making sure we have clean feed and water is going to be extremely important. And then the other thing is, really, I would encourage you not to share any of your poultry equipment with someone else. Let's be honest, we're all of the mindset that we want to help each other out, especially if it's someone that's new getting into the poultry business. That is perfectly fine. Just make sure that after they borrow your equipment, you take the time to really clean and disinfect it before you would then turn around and use it for your own birds. Now, keep in mind that air is an efficient way to spread disease when we start talking about poultry. And in some instances, it can travel up to a mile. So just because you think you have an isolated area, if a neighbor has birds that start to get sick, you really, really want to start to monitor your own birds just to make sure that nothing happens. There's always that possibility that it can blow through the air and then infect your birds, but it's more just something to be aware of so that you can monitor your own birds if you find out that some of your neighbors or that there's a disease prevalence occurring in the area. Now, when we talk about our food, we want to make sure that we keep it in covered containers, store it in a cool, dry place away from sunlight, and you ideally only want to buy enough food to last 3 to 4 weeks. Now, the caveat with this is if you are the only poultry person buying feed from the local feed mill and they buy you a ton of feed and you continue to use that same feed for the next 1.5 years because of the amount of birds you have, you may want to kindly ask the feed mill if there's a possibility of them getting you in some fresh feed and not necessarily the pallet that has been sitting in the warehouse for the last 1.5 years. So you need to be aware of how often you are feeding your feed, but also your feed source and how often they are getting poultry feed in for you to be feeding to your birds. Now, when we talk about the water, I talked a little bit about the chlorine solution. So you could make a stock solution of chlorinated drinking water, and the recipe's here, a tablespoon of bleach for a half gallon of water. Then what you're going to do is you're going to add 2 tablespoons of that stock solution to a gallon of water. And then when you give that to your birds, if you have 5 gallons, okay, so 10 tablespoons. And at the end of the week, then you just throw out your stock solution and make a new stock solution for the next week. Now, what you are doing when you chlorinate your drinking water is you're reducing that acidification as it goes into the gut. And as that bird drinks it, it's going to start to change the pH in the gastrointestinal tract. What happens is we will start to adjust that microbiota. And the idea is that you are promoting positive microbes within the gut by lowering the pH, and those that are more indicative of disease are dying off as a result of the lower pH. So you could achieve this with chlorine. You could also do it with the apple cider vinegar, as I said before. Same sort of concept. You're going to add 2 to 3 capfuls per gallon of water. You can do this every day. You could do this once a week. You could do this once a month. There isn't a prescribed way of how you want to chlorinate your drinking water for your birds. Just recognize that when you decide to do it, you're not going to negatively influence them. You're hopefully helping them for that next part of their life. So you could do it at phases. You could do it right before you give them outdoor access, right before you close them in. There's no right or wrong way to chlorinate your drinking water. So the other thing that can come up is, how should we actually chore? If we think about poultry a lot like humans or kids, we know that when we're exposed to sickness, we tend to see that there's a spectrum, and that spectrum is also age dependent. And so we know that young kids can get really sick. We know old kids can get really sick, and those in the middle, maybe not. So the way that we want to try to do this is we want to make sure that we interact with our youngest birds first to reduce the probability of them getting sick or being exposed to anything. And then as we move to our older birds, they should be more able to handle a disease challenge if you had something going on. So if we think about always starting with our youngest birds, moving to our oldest birds, and then if we're talking about healthy and sick birds, we always want to start with our healthiest birds and do our sick birds last. And so I gave you an example here. If we had a lot of birds, it may be that we start with our young chicks and then go to our healthy birds from youngest to oldest, go from our healthy birds then to our sick birds, and then our sick birds to our quarantine birds. And so you have the spectrum of how you can help reduce the chance of spreading disease. Now, this can seem very overwhelming for everything I just said. So what I want you to remember is try to always go from youngest to oldest and try to go from healthy to sick. And as long as you do that, I can almost guarantee that you will have a very positive experience if you have any sort of challenge with your poultry when it comes to health. So we've talked a little bit about using coveralls, boots, plastic booties. The other thing you can do is also set up some sort of a foot bath. And what I mean by that is just a pan that has some chlorinated water in it. And you can step into that chlorinated water before you would actually go into your chicken coop. The thing to keep in mind if you're doing that is if you have any dirt or any organic matter on your shoes when you step into that chlorinated water, it will actually destroy all that chlorine. And so in order to use a foot bath, you would want to make sure you have some sort of a brush there to clean your boots prior to stepping into that bird area. Just some references. If you have questions about that, let me know. Any questions at this point? If so, populate them in the chat. If not, let's be honest, biosecurity is by far the worst thing you could ever have to cover, and to cover it virtually makes it even that much more challenging. So now let's go on to something that I think all of you will be much more excited about. Let's talk about management, because really that's what we're here to talk about today. When we talk about poultry management, we're talking about a few things. First, we want to have our temperature control. We want to have good ventilation for our birds. We've got to think about their light and what we're providing to them. We want to protect them from predators. We want it to be easy to clean so that at the conclusion of our poultry experience, we can clean it up and get ready for a new batch, or just clean it up because we're done. And we want to make sure that we're giving our birds adequate space. So when we talk about backyard poultry, and it doesn't matter if you have 6 birds, if you've got 50 birds, 100 birds, everybody has a different concept for what it may look like. And so these are just some various examples, right? It could be in the bottom left corner where we just kind of hodgepodge together a chicken coop of pieces laying around the house. It could be something more complex, like in the upper right corner, where they take a prefab building and they're modifying it to fit their poultry experience. There's nothing wrong with any approach to doing this. You just got to keep some of those things that we talked about in mind as we're doing it. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of the different areas and some things to think about as you're putting together your poultry house. In my ideal world, all of you would have cement floors and washable walls. Now, let's be honest, that is going to be a limitation. But what it achieves by being able to have that sort of a construct is we can easily clean it up and wash it down. There's nothing wrong with having a dirt floor and having wood sides or mesh, wire mesh, whatever. We just need to think about, okay, if we have this type of a construction, how am I going to clean and disinfect it when I'm done? Or if I need to do something during the time that the birds are in the house, what am I going to do? Most everybody will have some sort of plastic or metal nest boxes for the eggs, maybe plastic transport coops, feeders, waters. We want to make sure that no matter what we have, that we are taking the time to really clean it up. In between our flocks, we want to be able to scoop out any of the old litter. So it's not necessarily advantageous for you to have a dirt floor if you can't go in and easily clean it out. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about that as we're trying to clean it out. Maybe it means you're going to take a little bit of the soil each time you clean out your chicken coop. Or maybe you decide you want to actually put down some gravel on top of the dirt and then put your bedding on top of the gravel so it drains better. There's lots of different ways that we can think about construction. We want to make sure that we can clean it with soap and water. So whatever you're using, make sure it's going to be water resistant. And that really comes into play when we start thinking about running electrical outlets or anything like that to our chicken coop. We want to make sure that they're dust proof as well as waterproof. When we're done or during our processing of our chicken coop to get ready, we want to make sure that after we've cleaned it with soap and water that we can disinfect it and let it dry for a period of time. And just keep in mind that no matter what we use, when we talk about dirt and wood, they're almost impossible to clean and to disinfect. And so there will always be additional challenges with dirt and wood. That doesn't mean you can't use them. You just have to think about those challenges as you start your poultry experience. So building size and space, the best thing that happened is that I went to Wisconsin for my master's degree because they have kept every poultry bulletin that was ever produced by a state in the US up until 1990. And so during my master's, I spent a lot of time of going through old extension bulletins across the US. So I have housing plans ad nauseam for poultry from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So if anybody needs any plans, just reach out to your local educator. Let me know. They can reach out to me. We'll get you some plans sent. They're old, but you can update the materials and still have a very good plan and suggestion on how to build different size coops. Ideally, when we think about it, we're going to have some sort of a solid structure to keep our birds out of the inclement weather. We may decide that we want to give them some sort of a door for an outdoor run for them to go outside. We probably want to have some windows and some vents. We may want to have wiring for lights, outlets. Some people go and add flooring and insulation. It really depends on how complex you want it to look like. So again, we want to think about the dust and moisture resistant receptacles if we're going to add electricity. Think about your bulbs. Okay, we're really moving away from being able to find incandescent bulbs now more towards the LED and fluorescence. And so it's okay to use those types of bulbs with poultry. Some people have expressed concerns about the flicker rate of LEDs and fluorescent bulbs and the fact that those could disrupt poultry. And in fact, the flicker rate is so fast that even for birds, it won't bother them. So you don't have to worry about a flicker rate when we start talking about using newer types of bulbs for poultry housing. To give you a rough idea, an 8x8 area would be about enough room for 15 to 30 laying hens or broiler chickens or about 10 turkeys. So just trying to give you a frame of reference for size. Now, when we talk about our bedding, we want to make sure that we're maintaining clean bedding at all times for our birds. What this would entail is we can just top dress our chicken coops. There's no need to remove the bedding every day or every week. The only time that would be the exception is if something happened and our water fell over, I don't know, it didn't seal correctly. And so now you just ran 5 gallons of water into your bedding. At that point, I would go through, I would remove all of my wet bedding and then start my process again of adding in new bedding. We are typically talking about shavings or some sort of a pine wood sawdust that we're wanting to use. Do not use hardwoods. The challenges with hardwoods is that we typically do not kiln dry the hardwoods. Now, if you have access to a hardwood that has been kiln dried, you can use it. If the hardwood has not been kiln dried, where the challenge arrives is that there tends to be a lot of molds and funguses within that shaving of the hardwood. And when it becomes wet, it also produces a gas that is toxic to poultry. So if you start using hardwood shavings that haven't been dried, you're going to notice either some mortality as a result of those gases being exhausted as they become wet, or you will notice that you can start to get some nodules within the lungs, pending you have it diagnosed by a veterinarian, that are actually mold spores that have started to grow within the bird because there was a fungus that was present in the hardwood. So in general, stay away from hardwood shavings. Straw is okay, but what is that wonderful thing on the outside of the straw? So waxy coating. Waxy coatings do not help absorb moisture. And that is one of the things that we're trying to do with our bedding. So if we're going to use straw, we want to make sure it's a chopped straw, ideally 1 to 2 inches in length. So that way the water can be absorbed internal to the inside of the straw. The one thing you will notice is if you use straw for your birds, you're going to probably use a lot of straw, and you will use a lot of straw directly around the feeder and the water. And the reason being that when those birds go to eat and drink, the natural response is to eat or drink and then also poop. And so you're going to find that that area around the feeder and water will become excessively dirty. And as you add more, they will also be spilling the water. So you're going to have a lot of straw added to help absorb that extra moisture. Now, when we think about temperature control, we want to think about the fact that we're really talking about the interaction with ventilation. So during the winter months, or even right now, our goal is to keep the house from freezing. That is really what we're trying to do. And so that may mean that we need to add in red heat lamps If it gets too cold, especially dependent upon the age of the birds, you could use heat tape to wrap around your water lines. But the one thing to keep in mind is that if we have adult birds, they have this wonderful thing that we actually pay money for called down. So the down jackets, the reason that we enjoy them as humans is because it insulates us and keeps us warm. Those birds take their feathers and the down around their body, and they can trap air between the feather and between the skin of the bird. So once they heat that area or that air within that area, they can actually maintain it and keep it trapped. So the other thing that we notice with birds during cold times is that they also huddle together or they flock together. And so between the peer-to-peer heat and what they can trap under their feathers, even if your chicken coop gets to be around 32 degrees or 30 degrees, just below, as long as the birds can get out of the wind and can get close together, they actually will have enough to maintain body heat and stay warm. What you would notice is that you will see an increase in their feed consumption because they're going to eat more to try to stay warm. The other thing that you'll notice, and which actually is the bigger challenge for people during the winter months, is that we need to keep that water unfrozen because we tend to see more dehydration occur with small flock birds than we do frostbite. And it's because when that water freezes solid, they can't drink. And so we need to keep that in mind, that it's this interaction of ventilation and temperature that we're trying to get rid of some of the things in the chicken coop during the winter months that we don't want. During the summer months, it's the complete opposite. We're trying to just move air through the chicken coop to help bring the body temperature down of the birds. And so we have two opposing things depending on the time of the year. So why do we worry about this ventilation? Well, what we're trying to do is to remove any moisture from inside the building. And so we're really trying to maintain the heat, but give enough ventilation or enough air into our chicken coop to get rid of any humidity. The other thing then is when we look at the hot weather, it's really not any sort of humidity or anything like that. We're just trying to get rid of the extra body heat those birds are creating. The other two things that we have to think about is gases that are being produced from the manure, so mainly ammonia. And then do we need to provide the fresh air for the birds? So when we look at this list that I have put here, the most important thing that we think about during ventilation is first going to be the moisture removal. Second would be the heat removal. Third would be ammonia and any other gases. And very last would be the fresh air. Now, why would we not be concerned about fresh air? And I can see you all in my mind raising your hand, wanting to yell at me and tell me the answer. The answer is the birds fly really high up, and so they don't have to have as much oxygen as we do. They have developed a very efficient system to pull oxygen out of the air because of flying at high altitudes. And so when we think about ventilation for our birds, fresh air is important, but it really is not going to be a main driver for why we're trying to ventilate our chicken coop. So when we talk about ventilation, we can have either a natural ventilation, which means we're just going to open up the windows and let it blow through, or we could have a powered ventilation. So when we talk about a natural ventilation during the summer months, we're probably, hopefully, going to open our doors and our windows. They're hopefully covered with some sort of a hardware cloth to keep the wild birds and the other rodents and pests out that we don't want. So that's during the summer. During the winter, then we would close those up and hopefully have some vents up along the peak of the chicken coop or towards the top so that the warm air will rise and go out. And at the same time, on the opposite side, we can have cold air coming in so that we create this pattern of cold air coming in, warming up, grabbing moisture, and then being exhausted out the other side. What happens when we can do this is that we're going to make our birds more comfortable. The litter is going to be drier and we'll tend to have less ammonia. I can tell you now that a lot of you may start to see your birds snicking. And for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, Chickens during the spring and during the fall with small flock tend to develop respiratory issues, and we call them snicking. And if you listen to the chickens, it's exactly what it sounds like, a snick. What is happening is we are going through this temperature fluctuation right now. So we go out at night, we close up our chicken coop because we know it's going to drop to 40 degrees tonight. So we're trying to keep everybody warm. So we close up our coop. And the next morning, we forget before we run to work that we need to open up the windows because we don't want to lose all the heat and make the birds cold. And so the windows end up closed until I get home about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I open them up. And at that point, it's 65 degrees. So now I have taken these birds, put them in an environment where we've closed the ventilation to try to keep them warm. They're producing moisture, everything like that. We keep it all contained, and then we're going to open up and exhaust it. What we're doing is we're just irritating the respiratory system because they're having the same issue that we do, which is that adjustment of being so hot and cold, hot and cold. So it's not uncommon. And typically when you see this problem, it really comes back to your ventilation and just being able to do a better job controlling it as we have the cyclic nature right now. Okay, the other way, and this is an example, we can do forced ventilation. And so in this scenario, this individual put a box fan in the corner so that during the summer when it gets really hot, they can turn it on and just force air through the house. And that's the idea behind a forced air. We're using some sort of fan or something to push that air through the chicken coop. What you will find is that if it's like this, those birds during the really hot days are going to try to all get right in front of that box fan. You're going to see them go like this, and they're going to spread their wings because they're trying to get that air underneath here where they have exposed skin. And you're going to see them just try to overall relax. So that's what they're trying to do at this point in time. Again, during the summer months, when we're looking at this type of a scenario, we really are just trying to move the air through the chicken coop. You can also do some other things if you want to help your birds. You could take things like frozen pop bottles. So take 2 liters, fill them with water, freeze them solid so that there's some ice. And if you know we're coming up to a really hot day, you can throw those in there, and it will not be uncommon to see birds that'll actually lay against those pop bottles and kind of drape their wing over that pop bottle with that ice. Because of the blood flow right here through the wing, they can quickly cool or help reduce that body temperature that they're experiencing. Ideally, when we talk about our chicken coop, we're shooting for that 70-degree range. That would be the ideal temperature if we could keep it year-round for our chickens. Personally, for me, that would be my ideal situation too, though, it's a little bit hard to get it when we have temperature fluctuations. Now, let's briefly touch on lighting. Lighting is 2 very different perspectives. The first one is when we look at laying hens. When we look at laying hens, we're looking at the fact that we're trying to provide enough light for them to lay eggs and to persist or consistently lay that egg every day. Our chickens are very much like our wild birds. And so hopefully all of you have noticed recently that once we start to see the sun come up in the morning, we hear the birds outside. They're very active right now. They're starting to make their nests. They are responding to the fact that we're increasing our day length. And as we increase our day length, their body says, you know what, it's time to produce baby chicks. And so they're going to prime the system and get ready to produce that egg. When we talk about laying hens, we're trying to get them to 16 hours of light. Once we hit that 16 hours of light, as long as we maintain that day length at 16 hours, they will continue to think it's time to lay an egg. If we think about our songbirds, they do the same thing. We come into spring, they start laying eggs, and they're going to maintain egg production. And then once we start to have our day lengths decrease here late summer into fall, we all of a sudden don't see any more eggs. Our wild birds at that point are saying, Day length is decreasing. It's time for me to stop laying eggs and get ready to fly south. Same with our laying hens. When we drop in our production for the amount of light that we're exposing them to, they are now triggered physiologically to say, whoa, I'm supposed to stop laying eggs. It's not time to reproduce anymore. So what we want to do with our laying hens is we want to bring them up to 16 hours of daylight. Typically, we want to start lighting our birds at about 18 weeks of age. At that point, you are probably around 10 to 12 hours of light. And you can increase the amount of light that you give the birds 1 hour every week until you hit 16. When you hit 16, you maintain that 16. When you are ready for your birds to no longer lay an egg, then you just decrease your day length. That could easily be that you're at 16 hours and tomorrow you only light them for a 10-hour day. Most of your birds, probably 95%, will quit laying eggs within about 3 to 4 days. There will be some that will still struggle on trying to produce eggs. Just keep in mind, once we hit whatever the maximum day length is, when you decrease it, you will knock them out of production. So when I was at Michigan State, I had a lady call me and she wanted to decrease the amount of light for her birds. And I said, okay, why is that? And she's like, well, my laying hens have been on 24 hours of light for the past year. So we had the nice conversation about the fact that you've lit them at 24 hours for the past year. If you bring it down to 23 hours, you will knock them out of production. And so we had to talk about the pros and cons of giving them that amount of day length. And then how do we deal with the fact that if you want to reduce it, you just accept the fact that you're going to be knocking those birds out of production. So those are laying hens. Now, if we flip it and we're looking at market birds, turkeys, broilers, any sort of meat bird, we really just have to let Mother Nature take control. We can just give them the day length at a sunrise to sunset. If you wanted to artificially light them, you could shoot for about a 10 to 12 hours of light, and that will be sufficient for those birds to effectively grow like they're meant to grow. Keep in mind that if we're talking about laying hens, they have been selected to only produce eggs. And if we're talking about meat birds, they have been bred only to produce meat. And so you'll see night and day differences as you start those two experiences for either growing very, very quickly and putting on a lot of meat, or they're going to have more of a slow controlled growth. But then once they start laying eggs, they're going to lay eggs every day until you decrease that day length. Okay, at this point, are there any questions to populate within the chat box? I'll give you a few seconds while I take a drink or two of tea, and then we'll go on to some flock issue discussions. Wow, I'll tell you what, you guys are so interactive. Okay, flock issues. Now, no matter what you say, if you've ever had a poultry experience, you have had some sort of a flock issue. But there are some things that we can keep in mind when we talk about poultry. First and foremost, they are very social and they have a hierarchy. And that will be established from top to bottom for both the males and the females, and resources, access to nesting space, feeders, waters, all of that is dictated by their hierarchy. So when we think about this, when you walk into your chicken coop, if you have a male and females, the very first chicken to greet you out the door is the male. He is the alpha male, and he is going to challenge you because he wants to make sure that you recognize he is the alpha male. Once you establish with that rooster that you, in fact, are the alpha male when you come to the chicken coop, you will notice he will run up to greet you and then will quickly fade back in with the rest of the birds. He will watch you the entire time, but he understands that you are the alpha male. If you have just females, egg-producing birds, you will see the same sort of behavior. There will be one or two hens that will greet you at the door. They won't attack you like the rooster does, but they will watch everything you do and monitor you to make sure that you're not going to disrupt their little social structure that they have going on. it is important, and it actually is helpful to you if you can identify kind of where people fall or where those hens or roosters fall within that social structure. If they are at the bottom of the hierarchy, you will usually find them hiding underneath the feeder, hiding in a corner, hiding way up high away from all the birds, because they are the pariah of the flock. And only when they can finally come down to eat or come down to get nesting space will you see them engage with the rest of the birds. The reason this is important is every time you introduce a new bird or you take out a bird and move it around, you're going to notice a disruption in that social structure. Males will always be the worst because you will end up finding an issue where it will look like a bloodbath because they're going to fight to figure out who is dominant and who is submissive. And if you had 5 roosters, all 5 roosters will fight because they have to establish who falls within that hierarchy. So just be aware of it and take that into consideration when you have to introduce new birds. The other thing that we can run into is cannibalism, and we don't know what sets it off, right? So I've listed some things here. It could be nervousness. It could be stresses because you moved them into a new chicken coop. It could be that they're too crowded. It could be that they don't have enough resource for either feeders or waters or nesting space. It could be that they don't have the right nutrition, maybe too much light. Laying hens, sometimes when they lay an egg, they prolapse, and the other hens, because it's shiny and looks different. Remember, I said that they like to peck at things if it's different. They're going to start to peck at that prolapse because they don't know what it is. And then all of a sudden there's blood. And then it's just, we don't want to go there. Okay. We also know that we can have some issues when it comes to just some birds being more timid. We know that chickens, and I hate to say this for all of you, but they are racist. So if you have one white chick and a whole bunch of black chicks, or a black chick and a whole bunch of white chicks, you will find that they will beat up the opposite color. Again, it goes back to this concept of you look different than me. Oh, well, let's see what's so different about you. And they peck, and then their friends start pecking, and everybody starts pecking. If you get an equal distribution or a variety of colors, you don't see any sort of excessive pecking as a result of color being factored into the equation. So some other things that can add to our cannibalistic issues that we may run into. Now, how do we fix it? If you go online, you can find goggles or bits, and these are little peepers is another thing they're called, and you stick them right in front of their eyes, and it's got a little bar that goes through the nair. And so what it creates is essentially sunglasses. And because chickens have their eyes on the side of their head, the only way they can ever see is to now turn their head to the left or to the right. Well, if you envision trying to eat something and you go to peck it, but you can only see it when you turn your head to the left or right, they constantly miss. And so that's one way that we can prevent it. We can also find what is called an anti-pick or a pine tar. All we're going to do is to cover up any sort of a wound that may have appeared on the birds. What it does is it takes that color away. And so the birds cannot differentiate the color. That's part of the reason that we use a red light when we brood our chicks, is because if there is blood that happens to appear, birds cannot differentiate blood from that red light. And so all we're trying to do is to dull their color vision so that they can't see things to continually pick at it. We can also remove the birds if we had to, or in some instances, if our light is too bright, we can dim our light to make it darker so that they have a harder time seeing each other, minimizing that interaction. We can also do things to keep the birds busy. So it could be that we give them some way blocks to eat. We can hang hay slices in the chicken coop. We can throw in green vegetable or grass clippings. We can take cracked corn and just throw in some handfuls into the litter so that they have to hunt and peck and try to find it. The key thing to keeping a bird busy is they have to be able to destroy it. When I was at Michigan State, we had some birds that started pecking. So we had a grad student who wanted to look at pecking behavior. So she put CDs hanging on string in one pen. She put hay slices in another pen. And then she took a third pen where she put hay slices and then plexiglass around the hay slices. So all the birds could do was peck at the hay slices, but they couldn't actually manipulate it or tear it apart. What we found is that the ones that can manipulate and tear apart that hay clipping or the hay slice, we pretty much eliminated any sort of pecking behavior. The ones that had the CDs, they would peck at them for a while, and for about 2 weeks, we reduced it, and then they started pecking at each other. The ones that saw the hay slices but couldn't get to them because of the plexiglass, that lasted for about 48 hours, and they went right back to picking at their friends. So we know that if you can give them the ability to destroy something, that actually helps redirect that behavior. The other thing is that we can do some beak trimming. And so you can see at the top here, that would be a light trim where we take just that hook off. A medium trim is we go a little bit further back. And then at the very bottom is a heavy trim where they've been trimmed too excessively. It's almost clear back to the nares. So if we're going to have to beak trim our birds, you can easily do it with a pair of dog clippers, and you just trim the hook off of the beak. And if they don't have a hook, they can't grab and tear and cause any harm. Or you could take a Dremel and just sand it down. We've done that in the past. Or you can also take some sort of a hot blade and you just sear it. And so you essentially burning the tip of your fingernail off, it keeps it from bleeding. If by chance, when you beak trim your birds, you happen to cut back too far and get into the quick, so to say, of the beak, you can easily just take your feed and use feed as a way to help stop the bleeding. And so it'll help it to clot. We've had a few questions come in, and I know I'm getting close to time. So how do you treat a prolapse in a laying hen? So if you would call a veterinarian, they would tell you you can just push it back in. And I'm going to tell you that at the end of the day, the only thing you can do to treat a prolapse is to actually call the bird. We have seen instances before where we've had a bird that prolapsed. We've tried treatments, tried everything, but once she has prolapse, she will continually prolapse. And so then you need to start thinking about the welfare and the well-being of that bird. And at the end of the day, the best option that you have available to you is to just go ahead and call that bird if you have a prolapse happen. In all reality, your incidence of a prolapse is going to be minuscule at best. Even with our commercial laying hens that are bred to lay an egg every single day, I would say we probably see less than 0.5% of a prolapse ever occur. So it's very rare to see a prolapse. It does occur from time to time, but that would be the best solution that you could do, is just to call that bird. Someone else posed a question related to the chlorinated drinking water, asking, is it something that's important to do year round, or is it something that you could just do at certain time points? Honestly, it doesn't matter. You could do it year round. If we look at commercial industry, they chlorinate their water year round. It's just something, it's easier for them to invest in the system to do it year round. If you wanted to only chlorinate your water a few times throughout the year, I would encourage you to do it in the springtime, maybe sometime in midsummer, and then again in the fall. And just pick 3 times that you want to chlorinate. The reason being spring, because of the fact that we're going through these temperature fluctuations. If you're letting your birds out, you can try to help get everything under control before you let them loose. During the summer months, just to kind of keep on top of things in case they're getting into stuff they're not supposed to be, if they're out and about. And then in the fall, do it right before we're getting ready to go into the winter and go to our minimum ventilation. That way, then we're trying to clean the system, get everybody up to 100% before we go to the minimum ventilation. Let's see, we're going to hit a few more things here, and then we'll see if you have any other questions. Mites and lice, so external parasites. The reason I want to hit this one is we are going into the time of year where it is likely you could start to see this. You can check the birds. If you're going to check your birds, you want to look around the vent of the bird, or you want to look, let me use my coconut chicken here. So we can look around the vent of the bird, and you would look here in the feathers. And what you would do is you would actually orient the hen like this. You would take and blow into the down right around the vent. If you have any ectoparasites, trust me, you will see them crawling. If we do, then we need to treat them. The other place that we can look on our chicken is right behind our earlobes. If we're going to have any sort of mites or lice that are present, they'll take up behind the earlobes as well. And so you can just look behind the earlobes, and you can see if you see any sort of mites or any eggs or nits. At that point, that'll give you a good idea. If you do in fact have some external parasites, you can dust the birds. You can do this by giving them some diatomaceous earth to dust bathe in, add it to the feed at the same time, and give a full approach to trying to control your external parasites. You can talk with a veterinarian who may be able to prescribe some off-label use of some things out there that we can use for livestock that aren't approved for poultry. Has to come from a veterinarian though, so talk to them. The other thing that we can use to control our external parasites would be elemental sulfur. So if you could get some sulfur, you could add or create a dust bathing area with some elemental sulfur in it that can also help to reduce parasites at that point in time. Let's see, looking at my other topics I have here, I think we'll stop here. We had another question come up about treated water in the city versus well water when it comes to chlorination. At the end of the day, it will not matter. So if you have city water and you can give your birds the city water, that will be sufficient. You don't need to do any extra chlorination on top of that. If you chlorinate your well, or you're doing something to treat the water coming out of your well for your own consumption, you don't necessarily have to go anything above and beyond for your birds. If you're doing nothing and you don't drink from your well, then I would probably do some investigation into counts and some other things that could also cause health problems with your birds. So typically, if you are consuming the water that is the same water your birds are consuming, you'll be perfectly fine. The chlorinating or adding in the vinegar is just something you can do on top to help with overall bird health. With that, are there any questions? All right, well, thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or to any of your contacts for educators, and they can help put us in touch, and more than willing to help you out if you have problems.
Thank you, Darren. That was very comprehensive and informative. I know I definitely learned some new things about poultry, and I even have a little bit of experience with them. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to present to us, and hope you have a good rest of your day. We are going to move on to oh, wait, we do have one question from Kurt. Are electrolytes needed during the summer in the water?
Yes, so when we talk about electrolytes, electrolytes are sort of like Gatorade, right? So we really want to boost those electrolyte needs. If we're going to use them during the summer, I would anticipate that you could be doing it when we know we're having some really hot weather and the birds may not be drinking as much as they should normally be drinking. So we could boost it at that point in time. The other time that you may want to add electrolytes into the water would be when you first start your baby chicks, to give them that little extra boost in case they're, dehydrated from being shipped in the mail or from picking them up at a hatchery or tractor supply company, as well as just making sure if they're not finding the feed right away, at least they've gotten sufficient water and electrolytes in the body.
Excellent. And Darren, actually, I thought of another question. Are there
Sure.
particular poultry species that you have more expertise in than others? Like, can we ask you about ducks or emus, as the question was earlier? What are the different species that we can ask you about?
Yep. So, from my experience with my parents growing up, I have waterfowl experience, duck, geese. We have turkey experience with both commercial and heritage. We've also played around with rat tights, so your ostriches, emus, game birds, as well as peafowl. So I would say pretty much any sort of poultry species you could ask me about.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we hope that you have a good rest of your night. And we will go ahead and move on to our aquaculture topic this evening. So Andrew Corsi is our presenter, but he pre-recorded this because he knew that he would be on vacation during this week. So I will be sharing his presentation on aquaculture in Illinois and Indiana from my computer. I will preface this by saying that the audio does cut in and out in a couple of spots, but in my previewing the presentation, I didn't find it to obstruct the message at all. So just keep that in mind as you're listening. If you turn up the sound on your device, that might help a little bit with that in a couple spots. But I will go ahead and cue that up. It might take me a minute to make sure that that is sharing correctly. So just bear with me real quick.
Hello, my name is Andrew Corsi, and I serve as an aquaculture specialist for Illinois Indiana Sea Grant at Purdue University. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about aquaculture and aquaponics in Illinois and Indiana and give an overview of the current production methods in both of those states. Now, when we talk about aquaculture, it's very important to point out the sustainability aspects of aquaculture, specifically the feed conversion ratio, which is the amount of feed required to gain 1 pound of body mass in an animal. So if we compare farm-raised fish to traditional livestock species such as chickens, pigs, and cattle, we see that farm-raised fish are much more efficient animals. It takes about 1.1 to 1.5 pounds of feed to produce 1 pound of flesh in farm-raised fish, compared to these higher values you see in chickens, pigs, and cattle. Now, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions produced by food production, fish are also very efficient. We see about a 7 times reduction in carbon dioxide when compared to cattle production, around 4 times less nitrogen, and around 2.5 times less phosphorus. When we look at aquaculture worldwide compared to capture fisheries, we can see that aquaculture is expanding rapidly. This data put out by the FAO in 2010 compares aquaculture to wild capture fisheries. And we can see that capture fisheries in the late 90s and early 2000s has really peaked and plateaued. So they're putting in incredible amounts of effort to go out and capture fish from the wild, and we can't capture anymore. We've really plateaued, and we will see a slight decrease in the future. Aquaculture, on the other hand, is expanding rapidly. In 2014, aquaculture production actually equaled that from capture fisheries and will only continue to expand in the future. When we look at aquaculture production in the United States, in 2020, the USA imported 22.4 billion pounds of edible seafood products, and over 50% of these were coming from farm fish. We currently export around 5.6 billion for a deficit of around 17 billion. So the USA is the #1 importer of foreign seafood products and only ranks 17th in the world for total aquaculture production. The species we produce are mainly salmon, oysters, mussels, and clams, and shrimp. And most of our production is currently done on the coasts. Very little aquaculture production is done in the Midwest. So that's something I'm looking to change. So what exactly is aquaculture? It is the culture of fish and aquatic invertebrates in a controlled environment. This can be earthen ponds This can be flow-through systems with water coming in from springs, artesian wells, dam outflows. It can also be done in cages and net pens that are enclosures that are suspended within lakes and ponds. It can be done also in a true controlled environment, which is a recirculating aquaculture system, or RAS or RAS systems. One form of these is known as aquaponics. That's where fish and plants are raised within the same system, and plants utilize the nutrients produced by the fish production. In Illinois, we produce about 1.5 million pounds of fish per year. These are specifically going to live markets. That's where fish are sold to a wholesaler while still alive and then shipped to markets. In Illinois, production is predominantly largemouth bass and hybrid striped bass. There are lesser amounts of catfish and tilapia produced. Ponds specifically are our #1 production method, followed by cage culture. In Indiana, around 3/4 millions of pounds of fish are produced annually, and these are predominantly done in RAS systems indoors. These would be tilapia and barramundi. There is some cage production of hybrid striped bass as well, around 100,000 pounds a year. Pond production of largemouth bass, and Aqua Bounty is also producing Atlantic salmon. So this 3/4 million pounds per year is likely to go up for the state of Indiana in the near future. So for the past 50 years or so, the vast majority of the fish we produce in Illinois and Indiana are going directly to live markets. Nearly all fish produced in Illinois and Indiana are sold live to wholesalers. Very little is processed for markets. So they're not being sold as fillets. They're being sold as fish that are being hauled directly to live markets. From ponds and cages, they're harvested and moved to holding tanks where a wholesaler comes to the farm on a live haul truck like this semi you can see in the picture here. And the fish are loaded directly onto the semi and then taken to market where they're sold live to consumers. The typical sale prices of fish from our states vary wildly. So hybrid striped bass sell for about 4.25 per pound. Their market size is 1.3 to 1.5 pounds. Largemouth bass, similar size for market. They are around $5.50 to $7 per pound, and they're our highest value fish that is produced in Illinois and Indiana. and we produce around 1 million pounds per year in Illinois. Channel catfish sell for about $1.25 a pound, tilapia for $2.35 a pound, and these numbers have really held steady over the past 15 years or so. Rainbow trout sell for around $3.50 to $4 a pound, and barramundi from $4 to $5 a pound. In the past, we produced other fish, yellow perch and freshwater prawn, but those aren't being done in very large numbers in the past few years. Now, there's benefits and limitations to all of the different culture methods that I've mentioned. For example, ponds, cages, things that are outdoors, you're going to see a lot of predation by birds and wildlife. They're open to pollution and catastrophes such as tornadoes, windstorms, flooding. You have no control of the water quality or temperatures in these large systems. They're prone to disease outbreaks, and there's going to be limited growth during winter and summer. There's also other issues such as you may not be able to harvest your fish in the wintertime because of ice, or during the middle of summer when your water temperatures are really high, because these are live markets. If you harvest the fish when the water's too warm, you're going to see a lot of mortalities. Now, there's a wider range of species suitable for pond culture, but there are a lot of regulatory, geographic, and biological limitations. And agricultural land costs really limit expansion. And these ponds and cage cultures are really not possible in urban environments. Controlled environments or RAS systems, recirculating aquaculture systems, they're much more costly than the pond production for electrical usage. You need to have electricity to aerate the systems or oxygenate the systems. You have to move water. You have to heat or chill your water. So all this uses electricity. And they're not ideal for all fish species. Certain animals work really, really good in RAS systems while others do not. So tilapia, trout, barramundi, salmon, perch, hybrid striped bass, or shrimp are really what is suitable for these RAS systems. Now with pond culture, ponds are designed to be harvested with a seine. A seine is a long net that stretches from bank to bank. It has lead weights on the bottom of the net to hold the bottom of the net to the bottom of the pond. It has floats to hold the top of the net on the surface of the water. It is then pulled from one end of the pond to the other, where the fish are concentrated and then harvested out. Now, these ponds are also designed to be drained after they're harvested. So a reliable water source is very critical to refilling your pond. So you don't have to rely on rain or overland flow of water to get water. It's also important to drain these ponds out after harvest, because when you go to restock those ponds, any large fish within the pond will quickly eat up the fish that you've stocked out. And because our market is for a narrow window of size, it's critical to have equal size throughout the pond so that most of your fish are marketable. Now, ponds also have to be aerated. This is typically done by electric paddle wheels, and it's very important to have emergency backup in case your electricity fails to your pond. This is typically done by PTO-driven paddle wheels or emergency backup generators. Now, this aeration does two things. It provides oxygen to the fish and bacteria that will live within the pond, but it also eliminates a thermocline within the pond. So all of the space within that pond is suitable habitat for fish within the pond. Also, holding tanks are essential to pond production because when fish are going to a live market, we need to move the fish we've harvested from a pond to a large holding tank where they're aerated and oxygenated, and they're also fed by well water, or the water is chilled so that these fish are held in a cold environment so they can ship to market with low mortalities. This is Big House Fish Farm in Carbondale, Illinois. They've got a good example of pond design to be utilized for fish production. So you can see the ponds are very long and rectangular. This is done so the fish can be harvested much easier. Also, when feeding fish, you can broadcast feed throughout the pond so that all fish are able to reach the feed. So if you have a large round pond, you're not going to be able to feed the middle of the pond, so some of those fish may not be fed. They also have a large storage reservoir, so when they drain a pond, they can capture that water for movement back to the pond. Another thing to notice here is they have nice graveled levees. Typically, we're pulling these seines with heavy machinery, so without a good levee that can be driven year-round, it's really difficult to harvest these fish out. And many of our large harvests are done in the wintertime for sale because the live markets generally have better prices in the wintertime. So this is when the bulk of our harvest is being done. So when you go to harvest ponds, your seine should be at least 1.5 times the width of the pond. You can even go up to 2 times the width of the pond and about 1.5 times the depth. This is done to ensure that we're getting 75% of the fish on the first pass. You'll never get all the fish on the first pass of the seine, but it's important to get as many as you can. It takes about 5 people to harvest a pond. It's also going to require boom trucks or cranes if you're doing this in very large volumes, and also likely the use of some boats. Another large production method in both Illinois and Indiana is cage culture. This is cages suspended in deep clear water lakes. This is predominantly done in private waters. We don't have any public production in public waters in both Illinois and Indiana. These floating cages are typically producing hybrid striped bass and rainbow trout, and in some cases we're producing juvenile largemouth bass to be stocked out into other ponds for grow out. When we compare this to what is known as net pens or sea pens production, these are much larger scale, but all of these require walkways or gangways to get out to feed your fish. And in Illinois and Indiana, it typically looks like this. Small cages that can be fed by boats or from gangways or docks. Now with cage culture, you're still going to have wildlife deterrence because the cages are open to predation. You're also going to require aeration, which is going to come from paddle wheels or regenerative blowers. and these will require an emergency backup. You're also going to need walkways and boats for feeding, a way to harvest the fish from these cages, which could be winch lifts, overhead cranes, or hydraulic lift systems. Another production method utilized heavily in Illinois and Indiana is recirculating aquaculture systems, or RAS systems. Now, these are an enclosed system that utilizes mechanical and biological filtration to remove toxic waste products from fish and feed while utilizing limited water exchange. Now, fish are unique. So about 86% of the waste from fish comes directly from their gills. It's dissolved directly into the water. So we cannot filter out the waste products from fish. So to do that, we employ bacteria or biological filtration to remove these toxic waste products. So this culture method is ideal in areas with stringent water regulations on water use and specifically sewer discharge. It's good in areas with poor soil or degraded environments, such as Superfund sites. It's really good in urban areas and old infrastructure like warehouses or old factories. And it pairs extremely well with aquaponics systems to utilize the excess nutrients that are built up within these RAS systems. So RAS and aquaponics systems, there are limitations on species that can be used. They have higher energy costs than pond production, and there's always the risk of power failures. So backup generation is very, very key to the survival of these systems. But you do have complete control of both the water quality and the water chemistry. You can stock at very high densities, up to about 3/4 to 1 pound per gallon with the right system. They're biosecure. You can treat disease within these systems. You can harvest year round, and you're essentially eliminating predation within these systems. Now, the basic design of a RAS system is shown here. You're utilizing gravity to your benefit. So the sump is going to be the lowest part of your system. In this case, it's a moving bed biological reactor as well, and I'll get into that in a second. But water is pumped from the sump through a pressurized line, through mechanical filtration. Any modifications needed to heat or chill your water, UV sterilization is possible, and then you have a clean inflow water which flows to your culture tanks. Once the water leaves your culture tanks, it has waste, it has excess feed, and it has the high levels of ammonia that are coming directly from your fish. This water goes through a drum filter or some sort of filtration method that removes the heavy solids while conserving water, and then the water then flows into our sump. In this case, our sump is also our biological reactor. So this is where the ammonia produced by the fish is being converted to nitrate by bacteria. Here are two examples of indoor RAS production in Indiana. On the left, we have Falling Waters Farm in Indianapolis. They produce tilapia in these long fiberglass raceways. In the back of the picture here, you can see their biological reactors with water spilling from the biological reactor directly into the culture tank. On the right, we have Handaloo Farms in Cutler, Indiana. They produce barramundi in these grain bin tanks. And this is done in an old swine production facility. Now, the waste products from fish, byproducts from protein metabolism within fish yields ammonia, which is dissolved directly into the water, as I stated earlier. 86% of this waste is coming directly from the gills, so it can't be captured by mechanical filtration, which gives us the need for biological filtration within these systems. Now, this ammonia that is produced by fish comes in a couple different forms. Unionized ammonia is very, very toxic to fish, and ionized ammonia is much less toxic. And we can control this process by the water chemistry. So if your water has a lower pH, it's going to be less toxic. It's going to have much more of the ionized ammonia. More salinity within the water will also yield more ionized ammonia. And the lower your water temperatures, you're going to have more ionized ammonia as well. Now, biological filtration is very important to these systems. It is the use of nitrifying bacteria to utilize waste products to convert ammonia to nitrite to its final product, which is nitrate. The ammonia to nitrite conversion is done by Nitrosomonas bacteria, and it is done in the presence of oxygen, and it needs a pH between 6.5 and 9, and it works best at higher temperatures above 50 degrees. Calcium and bicarbonate are also utilized during this process. Nitrite is converted to nitrate by another type of bacteria called Nitrobacter or Nitrospira bacteria, and it requires the same conditions as Nitrosomonas bacteria. Now, nitrate is non-toxic to most fish species at most concentrations found in RAS systems, which is around 100 to 400 milligrams per liter. So to view this process in detail, you can see that ammonia is converted by Nitrosomonas bacteria within an environment of oxygen and alkalinity. Nitrite is converted to nitrate by Nitrobacter bacteria in the presence of oxygen and alkalinity as well. So it's important to note here that oxygen is being utilized by both the fish and the bacterial community. So providing a very oxygen-rich environment is key to a successful RAS system. Now, these bacterial communities are cultured in what's known as a biofilter or a biological reactor. There's many different types of biofilters, but they're all really doing the same thing. They're providing a perfect environment for this bacteria to grow, and it's providing a lot of surface area for this bacteria to grow upon. So these are done in trickle filters, moving bed biological reactors, rotating biological contactors, expandable media filters, fluidized beds, and this bacteria really grows on all surfaces within the system as well. Here are two examples of moving bed biological reactors. On the left, we have Hanaloo Farms in Cutler, Indiana. They use a MBBR here in this concrete raceway. And essentially what you're doing here is you're filling this concrete raceway with bio balls or bio beads. There's a lot of different names for them. And you're introducing a lot of aeration, atmospheric air being pumped into the system by regenerative blowers. And this does two things. It provides oxygen to the bacteria, and it also moves these beads around. So by doing that, they actually scrape against each other, and they knock off any excess bacterial growth that grows upon the bead. So as the bacterial bed grows, it lessens the total surface area of that bead and makes it less efficient. So it's really cleaning itself and providing aeration at the same time. On the right, we have another example of an MBBR at Basler Fish Farm in Heron, Illinois. This is the nitrogen cycle. It's important to note that the growth of bacteria is rather slow within these systems. So at day one, you're going to have very low concentrations of ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate. But over the first month, you're going to see some significant changes in water quality. So initially, you're going to see a spike of ammonia. That's because the bacteria present within these systems has not really grown to its ideal size yet. So until that ammonia reaches a certain level, your bacteria level is going to be low. So ammonia, in this case, spiked to around 1 milligram per liter at initial stocking into a 15,000 gallon system that was employed at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. This level, this 1.25, is very toxic to fish. So during your initial stock out, you're going to see spikes of both ammonia and nitrite within these systems. So your initial spike of ammonia is going to be anywhere from 7 to 14 days. Nitrite will spike somewhere around 14 to 20 days. And nitrate begins to grow after these two initial spikes. So once you have a high level of nitrite within the system, both your ammonia and nitrite, the toxic components, are going to be very low. So one way of understanding these systems is a high level of nitrate within the system indicates a healthy biofilter. So in essence, these RAS systems are nitrate and phosphate concentrators. We're doing limited water exchange within these systems, so we lose a lot of water to evaporation. So all of our nutrients held within these systems really concentrate. So what do we do with this? The higher nitrate concentration is generally correlated with feeding. Higher protein percentages are going to yield a higher nitrate concentration. Higher feed rates are also going to give a higher nitrate concentration. Most fish feeds also contain about 0.5 to 1.5% phosphorus, which also concentrates within the system. Dissolved nitrates can often reach 200 milligrams per liter with limited water exchange also within these systems. Other nutrients concentrate over time as well. These would be salts, calcium, iron, magnesium, and chemistry of your water source is very key to these systems because all of these nutrients will concentrate over time. We can utilize those excess nutrients within aquaponic systems. So we utilize the excess nutrients produced by the fish for plant growth. This does a lot of things to our benefit. This would limit sewer and environmental discharge, which would help us maintain compliance with all the city, county, and state regulations. But within aquaponic systems, you really need to have a healthy balance. So you need to choose plants and fish that require similar water quality. Most plants require a low pH, very little amounts of salt, high nitrate concentrations, phosphate, and potassium as well. Most fish require a pH between 6.8 and 9. So you got to choose fish and plants that are compatible. This limits options on both the fish and the plants. High value aquaculture species may not be possible in these situations. This is a schematic done by Hygie Kim out of Purdue Horticulture. It just gives an overall design of an aquaponic system. So fish are held within a culture tank. Sediment tanks reduce the amount of suspended solids within the system. Water is pumped through a biofilter. Biofiltration is key in aquaponics, much as it is within RAS, because without that bacteria, ammonia would be the only source of nutrients within the system, and it is toxic to both the fish and plants. So it's key that we're getting conversion of ammonia to nitrite and nitrate through biofiltration. Water then flows through the grow bed where these nitrates are pulled out for plant growth, and then the water then returns to the fish tank. It's also key, we have an air pump on this system that's delivering air directly to the fish and the grow bed as well. It's important to aerate the roots of your plants to ensure that that the water is not anoxic within the grow bed. Now, if we look at the general water quality parameters needed for both plants and fish, we can see that warm season and cool season plants have specific needs, and warm water and cold water fish have specific needs. We also look at the pH needed by both fish and plants and the microbes as well. So within RAS systems, the bacteria is by far the most important species that we need to culture, because without it, both our fish and the plants cannot survive. So we really need to meet the needs of the microbes more than anything. If we look at dissolved oxygen needed for both plants and fish and the microbes, we can see that the DO is very important. So plants require dissolved oxygen in terms of milligrams per liter above 3. Fish require at a minimum 4 milligrams per liter to survive, higher levels in order to thrive and grow. And the microbes, the bacteria present within these systems, require a high dissolved oxygen level as well to convert ammonia to nitrate. So the ideal water quality parameters for aquaponics, we're going to see a temperature somewhere between 20 and 30 degrees C, a pH of around 7. This meets the needs of both the plants and the fish. It's not ideal for the plants, but it does work. Low ammonia, low nitrite, and good concentrations of nitrite within the system. Now, aquaponics can be done in a lot of different ways. What we see commercially, the most commercially employed method is a deep water culture or raft system. This is just floating boards placed on top of a tank. The plants are planted into small net pots within these floating boards, and the roots hang down into a tank full of water that is aerated. This way, they're provided oxygen for aeration, and they're suspended within the water to pull nutrients out. Ebb and flow systems are seen in commercial production as well. That is a tank that periodically fills and drains. So when the water fills the tank, plants are provided nutrients, and when it drains out, the roots are then aerated so the plants can grow, and you don't get root rot or root problems. Nutrient film techniques or gutter systems, which throw a small amount of water through a gutter system where the roots are suspended and pull nutrients from the water. The only issue with nutrient film techniques is that within aquaponic systems, there's a lot of bacterial growth and suspended solids, and you tend to get a lot of clogging in these systems. The same goes for aeroponics and drip irrigation. These work much better in hydroponically based systems. Now, deep water culture systems, they're the most commercially adopted aquaponics technique. Generally, they're utilizing food grade floating platforms with holes or net pots to support the plants. Roots are continually submerged, which means aeration can be an issue. You get a lot of accumulation of settleable solids in the raft tank and the deep water tanks. So there's a lot of aeration needed due to the low O2 environment in those systems. This is Falling Waters Farm in Indianapolis, Indiana. They're actually growing commercial hemp here, and they're doing this on a rack-based system and a deep water culture method. This is Windy City Harvest Farm on Ogden in Chicago. They do a raft-based system as well, and they grow lettuce. Now, flood and drain or ebb and flow systems, they are typically controlled by a bell siphon or timed water flow. These are media-based grow beds, such as gravel, clay pellets, foam, rock wool, crushed limestone, etc. The plant roots are exposed to water and nutrients when the system fills, and then they're then drained to provide aeration to the roots. The only issue with these systems is that the gravel or the sediment within them acts as biofiltration and sediment capture. Now, the problem with this is that you get a lot of clogging, excess bacterial growth, excess feed, settleable solids, all fill up these tanks. So you get inefficient biofiltration, channeling of water flow, and they're also prone to pests, things like fungus, gnats, and shoreflies. You can see here, this is another picture from the farm on Ogden at Windy City Harvest. They have a media-based grow bed controlled by bell siphons. And in this picture, you can see they've got some sweet basil here at the front, and on the back, they actually have aloe plants. Now, nutrient film technique, these are channel or gutter style systems. They have a thin film of water flowing through square or round pipes with plants planted at the top of the pipe, so the roots are suspended directly into the water flow. The disadvantage to these is clogging of the channels due to root growth and the constant bacterial growth within these systems. This is an example of an NFT system at the Purdue horticulture greenhouses. So in traditional aquaponics, fish and plants are held within the same system. These are typically raft or ebb and flow systems, but you're really dealing with a compromise. You're providing marginal conditions to both the plants and the fish. So you have to rely on your plants to remove nitrogen from these systems. So balance is very important to both the fish and the plants and can be difficult to achieve as plants are removed from the system or fish are removed from the system. So the amount of plants within the system is critical to the nitrogen removal. So balance is critical to the system health. And so this can be very difficult to maintain. New research is showing that decoupled systems really are the best of both. So this would be an RAS system, and a hydroponic system utilizing wastewater from the RAS system. So in this example, RAS systems would be storing their wastewater in a storage tank, and then this water would then be modified to meet the needs of the plants. So you could add micronutrients such as copper, potassium, phosphates, and you can modify the pH. You can drop it down to levels that are much more suitable to plant growth. But there's much more additional costs involved in this in terms of complexity, electricity, and automation for these systems. But it does give you the ability to grow the high value fish species that may have needs that aren't suitable in aquaponic systems, and plants that can be grown hydroponically utilizing that wastewater that may be more high value species. So here are two examples of this from Hygie Kim's lab at Purdue University. On the right-hand side, we have traditional aquaponics with fish and plants held in the same system. And on the left, we have a decoupled system. This utilizes a separate RAS system. All of its wastewater is held into a storage tank, which then is being delivered off to these NFT systems. In this example, we're modifying the pH of the water that's being delivered to the plants to be around 5.8, where the water held in the RAS systems is around 7.8 to 8. So just by reducing that pH, we're able to get much better production on the plant side. Now, in terms of aquaponics, over 150 different vegetables, flowers, herbs, and small trees have been grown successfully within aquaponic systems. I've seen lettuce, Swiss chard, many different types of herbs and microgreens, things like basil, tomatoes, and cucumbers, watercress, cabbage and peppers, and other things like marigolds, aquatic flowers such as lotus. As I mentioned earlier, in Indianapolis, Indiana, Falling Waters Farm is growing commercial hemp using aquaponic systems, and other things like aloe. These are all possible to do within these aquaponic systems. What is key to a successful RAS or aquaponics production is you really need to identify your market and demand prior to production. As I've said, the vast majority of the fish we sell within both of our states are going to live markets. So there are not any large processing areas where we can send our fish off to be processed for use in restaurants and grocery stores as boneless fillets. So you really need to identify your market and demand before you start production. If you are going to set up a system utilizing processed fish, you're going to need to be HACCP certified in order to distribute those products. So understand where your fish are going to be sold, where your plants are going to be sold. Are you going to sell to restaurants? Are you going to sell to grocery stores or farmers markets? Or are you going to sell directly from your farm? So it's really also important to understand the regulations and permits regarding processing of fish as plants in order to achieve your goal. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at the email address shown here. It is acourse@purdue.edu. My phone number in my office is listed as well. And if you could, please visit the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant website at iiseagrant.org, and please visit eatmidwestfish.org as well. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, folks. We can actually post Andrew Coursey's contact information here in the chat real quick, so I'm going to drop that in there. In the meantime, Jenna has posted our survey, which is voluntary and confidential. We encourage you to go ahead and take that survey to give us feedback on this program. That helps us improve our programs in the future, so we'd appreciate it if you take a few minutes to go ahead and complete that. Bear with me while I get Andrew's contact information posted. And please, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat. And with that, if there are no questions, we appreciate your attendance this evening. Please reach out to us if you have any further questions about each of the topics that were presented this evening, and keep an eye out for more bi-state programs coming up throughout the year. We typically have a programming season that lasts December through March, and we talk about everything from row crops to gardening to small scale ag and pasture topics. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any topic ideas as well, and we appreciate your attendance this evening. We will have the recording ready within the next couple of weeks, so please keep an eye out for that in your email that you use to register. Thank you very much on behalf of the bi-state team.